Well, it's Tuesday again.
Right.
And we're still doing scales and gauges. And we're actually still doing O-scale of
fun.
all things.
There it
O-scale.
is, on the caboose.
And we've been talking to this point about people doing standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches, and the problems associated with a gauge at 1.25 inches that actually makes the gauge 5 feet, and all the different things that people have done to sort of cheat that. Well, there's a lot of people out there who have no interest in modeling standard gauge. They want to model a narrow gauge railroad.
Well, that's cool.
And we've ridden many a narrow gauge railroad.
Yeah, they're fun. I love them.
Durango and Chama, and in the western United States, that predominantly means 3-foot gauge. But in other parts of the world and in the eastern part of the United States, that meant 2-foot gauge.
Right.
So what about the people who want to model these narrow gauges, but they want to keep the scale in O-scale? But the tradition started back when they decided to do SMO, cheat the scale to make the gauge correct. Well, they just kept doing that for the narrow gauge.
Oh.
So if you want to make the gauge narrower, just keep making the model bigger and bigger. And they came up with 1/19th scale. And 1/19th scale, when cheated and running on an O-gauge track, a standard O-gauge track, actually makes the gauge a little bit wide, but they called that 2-foot gauge. Well, that's all very well and good unless you want to do a sort of a unified world where everything in your world is one scale,
Right.
1/48th scale. So they simply, knocked the rail in. And the nice thing there is that if you're modeling, say, 3-foot gauge, and you're at 1/4 of an inch to the foot at 48th scale, well, then that works out perfectly accurate at 3/4 of an inch.
Oh.
So they don't have to worry about this compromise, this weird thing, because their gauge isn't this oddball 4 feet, 8.5 inches. So they don't have to worry about that. The 2-foot gauge modelers, they don't have to worry about it either. Now it's just 1/2 inch for 1/4 inch scale. The designation for that has always been to add a small n and then the number. So in this case, O, and again, they switch from the number 0 to the letter O.
Okay.
O-N, followed by the gauge. So ON3 for 3-foot gauge. ON2 for 2-foot gauge. ON2.5, which is also ON30. Anyway, these different narrow gauges that people have done in O-scale.
Right.
Back when I first met Steve, really, Al, Al.
Oh,
He
Al.
was forever trying to get everybody together to do some amazing project or other. And he said, let's build a modular railroad. And at the time, he was just totally into East Coast ON2.
Oh, my.
And he'd been buying up this ON2 brass and modifying it and scratch building ON2 New England stuff. And so, we got together and we built this modular railroad, and it was part standard gauge, which was the cheated standard gauge. So it was 5-foot gauge. It was the full 1.25 inch gauge.
Right.
But then the little 2-foot narrow gauge, tramway, if you will, was the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes. So it's not really a tramway.
It was a mouthful.
Yeah, what a railroad. But it just looks so neat to see this teeny tiny little 2-foot gauge track crossing through the standard gauge track and running alongside. And at the train shows, people would come over and go, what? But that was our whole experience with 2-foot gauge. And then as things go, that module got completely taken apart, and Al kind of put all of his 2-foot gauge stuff in shoe boxes and whatnot. And we moved on to 3-foot gauge,
Oh my.
which is what Steve had been doing in his attic for years and years and years.
Right.
And so there again, now he didn't have any standard gauge, but then when we built our big railroad at the MRS hobby shop, that was dual gauge. It was standard gauge, the full size, again, 1 1/4 inches, and On3.
Right.
And so had those two mixed up. None of this would have been possible had we been cheating the scale. We had to keep the scale at 1/4 of an inch and then just move the gauge around to accommodate the different size trains. So many of the railroads wanted to run both standard and narrow gauge.
Right.
And we saw that in Chama.
Right.
That there's
Right.
dual gauge track there.
gauge.
So you've got standard gauge cars and you've got narrow gauge trains all on the same track, sharing the same right of way. Well, how do you do that if the standard gauge is wrong?
Oh.
Well, and there's a wider issue here. Get the pun. There's another issue here, and that's that not only were the people doing the standard gauge often modeling in 5-foot gauge, their wheel flanges and their wheels and everything were oversized too. Back when they were all toy trains, it was just an idea, well, that'll help keep the train from falling off as it's going around underneath the Christmas tree or whatever. But if you're trying to do serious scale modeling, well, you don't want these gigantic flanges contaminating your gauge, your scale. So the narrow gauges had a more accurate flange. They had a very accurate gauge, and that was just fine right up to the point where you wanted to do dual gauge.
Oh.
And now there's this conflict again. One set of your wheels is going to have one size flange and a different size width of tire and everything, and it just isn't going to work. And so trying to do dual gauge in O scale has always been a problem. It's done quite readily in other scales because they don't have that original problem of the wheel flanges being all screwy sizes. But in O, it was a problem. And this opened up a whole new field in model railroading, the Proto 48 group. And what they wanted to do is say, instead of just making the trains bigger to make the gauge appropriate or to leave the flanges the full size, let's throw all of the standards out. Let's stick with 48, prototypical 48 scale, knock the rail in to the proper 4 feet 8 1/2 inches, and let's make the flanges the correct size and the width of the wheel the correct size. And now if we want to do dual gauge, anything we want to do is going to work because we're following a very, very, very fine scale standard. Well, a funny thing happened some years later, and that was that Bachmann, in their infinite wisdom, wanted to come up with a series of trains to run with Department 56.
Really?
Christmas Village stuff, right?
Wow.
And so they thought, well, O scale is the good scale for that,
You think?
which is, why the railroad we saw in St. George uses Lionel.
Right.
But they said, well, how can we come up with something? So they said, let's design an O scale train that runs on HO gauge track.
Oh.
Because then they can just use their existing track system that they've got and
Right.
run that around the Department 56 and design some trains for it.
Wow.
Well, that makes the gauge 2.5 feet. Okay, so ON 30. And so they came out with a couple of different little Christmas train things in ON 30. I don't think they had any idea the phenomenon they just created, because ON 30 now became one of the most popular scales and gauges because it was this full-sized O scale equipment that ran around on effectively HO gauge track. And then they quickly found, well, they can't just cheat and do what they originally intended to do, and that was just use HO gauge track for this system. So they very quickly came out with a whole new track system that was appropriate to the scale and gauge, and it just really took off. Unfortunately, it's gone right back where it came from. They're not offering anything anymore, and they're not manufacturing anything. And
Gosh.
but there's still a lot of clubs and a lot of people out there who are doing that.
Oh, yes.
ON 2.5 feet, ON 30 has become quite a thing. But again, it's all because everybody wanted to keep the scale the same.
Right.
Where in parts of the world, like in Great Britain, they just did what they did. If they wanted to make the gauge narrower, they just made the model bigger. Well, you can't do that if you're constantly changing the scale around.
No.
Anyway, this particular system will now carry forward through all of the different scales. Just add in this idea of saying, okay, O small n 3, or HO small n 3, or HO small n 2.5. Whatever your narrow gauge is, the designation is to specify the scale, followed by the N to indicate that it's narrow gauge, and then the dimension in inches, typically speaking, of the railroad that you want to model.
Right.
Confusing?
It's very confusing.
All of this stuff is very confusing.
Right.
But this introduces us to this whole new section of scale and gauge, narrow gauge modeling.
Oh, fun.
Anyway, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, do subscribe to the channel. And the easy way to do that is with the blue button. Are we ready? Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here on Sunday with the Sunday show. We'll see you then.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.